In March, matter of fact, on March 11th, 1994, a modern epistle was penned and shared with a network of friends, advocates, philanthropists, and power brokers across the United States of America. The urgent appeal and call to action came this way and read in these words: Alex Haley's Farm is the folk school for life, character building, and citizenship and leadership training I have dreamed about to embody our vision of a renewed Black extended community family. A place where all generations can come and be and reconnect and teach and nurture and be nurtured and prepare ourselves for the transformation our families, communities, and nation. A place to mentor and train new servant leaders for the 1990s and 21st century. A place to model the behavior we seek to replicate in every community and family. A place to talk and sing and write and dance and laugh and prepare to re-enter the world with new energy and a clear shared vision. Going further, everyone will come because it is roots and because they are curious. They will keep coming because it feels like home and safe harbor we have lost, missed, and are searching for. And because it is beautiful, it will serve not only as the home for the Black Community Crusade for Children, but as a training, conference, and convening site for a variety of CDF networks and other groups to ensure its use year-round. While Haley will be a place for spiritual renewal and intergenerational mentoring for the Black Community Crusade for Children, it will also be a rigorous training school for a new breed of leaders for children and families of all races and disciplines needed to work collaboratively to strengthen children, families, and communities. This modern-day epistle from the pen of one of the mothers of our movement, Marian Wright Edelman, was a call to all to a space of sanctuary. It came in the midst. I tell people this was a letter written not to me, but for me. It came when I was getting myself ready to go to the prom in Dallas, Texas, my senior year in high school. There were those who cared so much about the issues that were going on around me and my family and my community and my neighborhood that they were calling all together to the sanctuary in order to rebuild, renew, praise, and celebrate so that we might prepare ourselves to rebuild a community that found itself in distress. Some of y'all forgot, some of y'all online don't even know what the 90s were about. In the 90s, we were wrestling with the community violence that took my brother and my youngest uncle from us just blocks away from my grandmother's home. In the 90s, we were wrestling with the teenage pregnancy that robbed the futures of our dear brother, of our dear sisters from us while we let our brothers off the hook. In the 90s, we were wrestling with drugs that were rampant in our community that was taking us out at pandemic proportions before anybody declared a pandemic in the rest of the community. In the 90s, there were children who were having their futures robbed from them before they could articulate the hope that they had in and of themselves. In the 90s, we had parents who had been robbed from their children by a war on drugs that had failed, except for the fact that it had fulfilled its promise to take parents away from children in our neighborhoods. I know y'all don't remember the 90s, but in the 90s, there were thousands of us being taken away from our communities. And even if you don't remember the 90s, you remember last year. Last year, in the midst of a pandemic, we saw increasing rises in violence in the district, in St. Louis, and all over the United States of America. Last year, we began to see thousands of us being taken out of our communities and taken away from their children. Last year, we began to see people who are robbed from a space and place of sanctuary and needing to be called back together in order to put our communities back together. Last year, someone came promising to build the nation back better. As if they were the only ones who could do it. For some, in the 90s, the entire answer to the ravaging of our communities was a crime bill. To some, the only answer was deeper investment in policing and, as Dr. Gardner Taylor suggests, the criminalization of our own children. But for some, for my predecessor, the mother of our movement, Moses named Marian, the answer to suffering communities and broken families was calling together a healing space for community building. And on this day where I find my firm footing for biblical reflection in the context of the 33rd chapter of Exodus, I am reminded we're not the only ones to deal with pandemic proportions. I'm reminded we're not the only ones to deal with plagues that rob communities of parents for children. This is what was going on in the text in the 33rd chapter of Exodus. I have to read back a little bit. Can I read back for a little bit? If I can read back to the 32nd chapter, you find what has happened is the leader, Moses, has gone up to the sacred space to be with God. As he has gone to talk with God, as he has come to know God and speak with God face to face, the scripture says, as a friend. He goes, and while he's talking to God, the people in the community say, we don't know what has become of this man Moses who has brought us up out of Egypt. And so since we don't know what has become of him, Aaron, you're here. Why don't you make for us gods that we might worship? Aaron immediately, if I read back in the 32nd chapter, it strikes me when I read back, he immediately responds by saying, go ahead, take off your earrings and your necklaces and put all your stuff together. We're going to melt it down and make a golden calf. Y'all know this, right? The people who are here for Sunday school understand exactly what's going on. You Bible scholars know what's happening. But what I missed in the text, having known this story over time, is that after they do this, after they engage in this horrific action, after they engage in revelry that sounds like acts and sounds of war, when Moses comes back with Joshua, they hear it and come down. Moses is so upset that he calls forth the people, calls them on it, and in what seems to be an act of remarkable violence for a biblical text, he calls the people and says, which side are you on? He says, who's with God? And the Levites say, we're with God. And he says, if you're with God, get your swords. And calls them to go throughout the community, taking the lives, 3,000 lives of their own sons and brothers. Having called this forth, they then go and he begins to appeal to God. At the end of the 32nd chapter, we see him appealing to God. Speaking on their behalf, seeking to make atonement for the challenges of the people. And even there, the Lord sent a plague to the people. The text says, sent a plague because they made the calf. New Revised Standard Version is real interesting for those of us who call ourselves to leadership, find ourselves in leadership, believe we're called to this role. He says, he sent a plague on the people because they made the calf. Then it has an interesting parenthetical note, the one that Aaron made. Maybe that's a lesson for leaders, but more than anything else, it is a reminder to us that a plague and a pandemic causes distance sometimes from God. Distance from spaces of sanctuary, distance because we have questions about the theologies that we had before the pandemic, distance because we tied being close to God with having stuff. Distance because we understood being close to God to having position and power. Distance because we understand being close to God being having space and place. Distance because we believe being close to God is having privileged place in the sanctuary, and now we can't even come to the sanctuary. Distance from God is what they were experiencing in chapter 32. And the question becomes, if you have distance from God, if you have been a delivered people, if you believe that you are a nation who has been blessed by God, either because of a narrative of American exceptionalism or because of the promise of privilege that we accept in the context of the Christian tradition, how do you rebuild a God-blessed nation that has had not only its sociology dismantled, but its theology deeply challenged? How do you rebuild? And that can't just be building back better, but you've got to build back best because you believe you have special relationship with God. And I want to suggest that what happens in the context of the text is a model. It is an example. Moses shows us how we build back best. Can I keep going here? If that's the question, then I have to go and wrestle for answers. As I go to the 33rd chapter and seek out scholarship, I hear the voice of Walter Brueggemann, that Old Testament scholar who argues that the primary agenda for the chapter here in 33 revolves around the awareness that survival depends on presence. Survival, he says, means exactly the durability of a cultural system that can provide a home for individual persons. Presence, he goes further, means the holy source of covenantal life in our very midst. What he's saying, if we gonna make it, God gonna have to be here. Moses is working to rebuild the relationship between Israel and God because of the future of the nation is at stake. At the end of the 32nd chapter, God sent a plague which is decimating those who understood themselves to be the chosen nation. God had decided they needed a break in their relationship because it's complicated, because the people were stiff-necked and idolatrous. God didn't renege on the promise of the land because God doesn't renege on God's promises. God don't play spades like y'all. But for the journey ahead, God would send an angel rather than going before the people, God's self. Don't miss that. In the midst of a plague, Moses was working to rebuild the nation by working to reconcile the nation's relationship with God. Moses was working to rebuild the nation not by building walls, not by passing legislation, but rather by seeking to reconcile their relationship with God. So how do you rebuild a God-blessed nation? Y'all not gonna like this, so hang with me for a second. How did he try to do it? I want to argue what he does in the text is he gets into an argument with God. There's distance between me and God. There's plagues in my community. We have space between us and our historic relationship. We don't feel like the chosen people. And now you want me to get into an argument with God. I don't want you to, but I'm just suggesting that's what Moses did. Is that all right? What Moses does is gets into an argument with God. And first what he tries to do is to assure God's presence by arguing with the Almighty. When you feel distance, one of the things you can do, I hate to say this, but I'm going to teach some of y'all about your relationship. It's not in my manuscript, but I'm going to tell you about your relationship. Sometimes there are people you're in relationship with who get in an argument with you simply because they don't feel any passion in the relationship anymore. And so when they can't feel love, they just want to feel something. And so they instigate and antagonize you such that there's some emotion between the two of you. And I'm suggesting what Moses does, because he recognizes it's space between God and the people, is he instigates an argument to assure God's ongoing presence. God, are you still there? God, can you hear me now? He engages there in order to assure God's presence by the argument. Arguments. I know y'all don't like this. Y'all peaceable people. Y'all been here 145 years because y'all all get along with each other. I know. Y'all have never had 145 years. Good Baptists for 145 years. Y'all never had a church meeting that ended up on the parking lot. I understand. Y'all have long pastorates and people stay here because y'all love them and they love you and nobody goes on any other place. Nobody ever left here mad because it's Mount Carmel Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. I understand that, but I want to teach y'all a little bit about some of the arguments I have seen, because I grew up 45 years in congregational polity in Baptist churches, National Baptist Church, PMBC, United Church of Christ, and all of these churches with congregational polity, except for Mount Carmel, they have arguments. They have arguments. They have congregational polity. Ain't no bishop to resolve the issue. Ain't no, you read down the history of some of our congregations in our convention, you see some arguments. It's an argument on the convention floor in Philadelphia. Arguments over the Young Turks and those who are established leaders in the congregation, who in the convention who don't believe in civil rights. Arguments over over who's going to be the face and the voice of the church. There's some arguments, and I'm going to suggest some good things have come out of those arguments, and some good stuff came out of the argument in this text as well. But you got to know how to argue. Arguments are opportunities to strengthen relationships our convictions, and our values. The problem many times is not that we argue. The challenge for us is how we argue. The problem is not, it is in the context of devolved debate. In American democracy, much of our issue is that we have come to the point where we can't disagree or debate or argue without becoming divisive and objectifying the other. Debate and argument is part of the democratic process. It is part in the Baptist Church of congregational polity. With appropriate and honorable rules of engagement, arguments can be opportunities to build deeper community and relationship. God is big enough to hear our arguments. God will lean in, engage, and even oftentimes change God's own mind. I'm going to have to come back to that later. This strengthens our relationship with God and discipleship in community. In this passage, Moses models that sometimes in times of tension, these can be opportunities to exercise disciplines of the Spirit. Christian mystic and theologian Howard Thurman, in a brief work, reflects on 5 significant spiritual disciplines. Argument is an opportunity to engage all 5 of Thurman's disciplines, disciplines of the Spirit: suffering, commitment, growth in wisdom and stature, prayer, and reconciliation. Prayer is an argument that is initiated by suffering, demonstrates commitment while opening opportunities for growth and reconciliation. I'll say that again, somebody missed it. Prayer is an argument that is initiated by suffering, demonstrates commitment, because if you weren't committed, you just walk away, while opening opportunities for growth, because you want to hear. Those of you who know prayer well know that it's as much listening as it is talking, and invites opportunity for reconciliation, making the relationship right with the person you was mad at in the first place. We can use prayer as an argument that is initiated by suffering, as an expression of commitment that opens doors for growth in our own wisdom and stature, as well as reconciliation to others and God. Moses sees the conditions of his people.